Okay, for this live stream, we're going to be going over these three topics: the View, George Takei, and Tucker Carlson. Going to be a little bit interesting because it's not really going to be what people are probably thinking with those three topics. Obviously, it's people are going to probably think it's like clickbait, but it's not really because we are actually discussing them, but not in the way that people might want to actually assume. First one is on the View. We're talking about Meghan McCain versus Tulsi Gabbard. Meghan McCain is basically pretty much just basically blowing her mouth off on Tulsi Gabbard. Basically blowing her mouth off, saying that Tulsi Gabbard is, by meeting with Assad, she's basically meeting with terrorists. Except one little problem there. Assad is basically was actually trying to expel terrorists from his country, uh, to actually protect the actual sovereign citizens. The actual people that were terrorists were actually ones that were fighting from the people who were actually the so-called rebels. The only rebel group that was actually considered legitimate was actually the Kurdish fighters. Now, the Kurdish fighters have essentially pretty much have had some type of agreement, or are expecting to get some type of agreement to live within uh, the Syrian the within Syria, pretty much within the own people within the other people themselves. And it doesn't seem like they were expecting to eliminate Assad to begin with the way they were actually going. It seems more like they were their whole goal itself was to expel these actual terrorists. Now, where were they coming from? Well, these were essentially created from the actual interventions from Libya and Iraq, both from the Obama and Bush administrations. So if we look at that, we see that these were basically caused by American interventions supported. They were supported by both Israel and Saudi Arabia. So when we examine that, we see that essentially that they were doing nothing but the way they've reacted to this is since they're not continually fighting and trying to advance toward Damascus, we see that they're actually not interested in taking out Assad, which is the sole reason that we see that uh, uh, Netanyahu is actually pissed and he wants to take out Assad. Now, this is why we see people like Meghan McCain try to make baseless accusations about Tulsi Gabbard. Now, who is Meghan McCain? Meghan McCain is the daughter of former Senator and deceased Senator John McCain. John McCain used to be in the Navy. He basically was captured after he ran a ship. He ran his naval airplane into a tree, and he was captured. And he basically was kept under good care because he was willing to essentially squeal and give anti-American propaganda tapes to and deliver these over the air to the American forces while under the capture of the of communist, or I should say actually socialist Vietnamese. They weren't fully communist at this time with it, uh, as much as people thought. But so when we so when but the fact is these were end up kind of hidden from the in the CIA. They put these kind of tapes under wraps because of it being bad, especially when he came back, and they gave him all these things like Medal of Honor and all this other garbage, when in fact he was actually a traitor to the country. Now, when we see Meghan McCain, they try to parade her as being this daughter of this fallen hero of the country, and they try to make her out to be this great person. Well, the fact is her dad was a traitor. He went to the Senate and was essentially voting for whatever war he could, and he was a neoconservative that believed in basically sending people off to their death. Meanwhile, he was essentially a horrible naval soldier. He placed one of the lowest amounts with lowest scores while in the Navy, which should have essentially got him almost no job, but because his father and grandfather were already had already been high positions, it ended up getting him passed through. He would then get to the point where he could actually be a pilot. Well, when he was a pilot on a ship, he would essentially do these wet starts, and this ended up causing essentially massive explosions, leading to nearly 190 people dead on one of the ships. And he essentially blamed it on some type of malfunction when they found no malfunction, and it was basically his fault on this. And he was known for doing this constantly to basically show off. He was essentially a braggart. And this is basically his type of personality. So he was no hero. And then when it came down to flying, he was notoriously a bad pilot. I mean, this is why even after his leg had healed, I mean, usually most people from the military that were actually pilots will actually develop having a pilot's license on their own, even after the point, because they want to essentially avoid the point of taking the commercial airlines, because it makes it a lot easier to get from point A to point B. They'd rather do it on their own and avoid the hassle of going through all the lines and the TSA and all this other garbage when they could actually go and pass through all the lines. Because even if you're a senator, you have to pass through all this other garbage. And even people like Rand Paul and Ron Paul have even had to go through all these lines. So when it comes down to this argument is basically she was trying to make the accusation that Tulsi Gabbard is unpatriotic and meeting with Assad to actually get information on what was really going on. Well, what we actually have on her dad actually met with Ansar al-Sharia members, which is actually a terrorist organization listed by the State Department. And this is actually the group that we were actually fighting, that actually is who we should have been fighting out there, not arming. And they're considered to be very, very violent. This is actually the same group who actually killed our people in Benghazi. And these are the same types of people who he was actually meeting with. These are the same people who he was meeting with. And he claimed them as good people, and we need to arm these people. And there's these pictures out online. You'll actually see them. And one of the people was actually caught that he was meeting with his arm around him, was actually caught eating another person's heart. That's not a person you want to be meeting and calling a good guy. That's not a good person. A person who engages in cannibalism is not a good person. So when we talk about this, there's a stark difference between meeting with a person for actually doing your role as for foreign relations and trying to get a better feel for what's really going on in Syria, next to actually a person who basically their dad was meeting with terrorists. There's a stark difference between the two. I would rather be having a case where I'm meeting with an actual leader of a country and actually having a dialogue and seeing really what's going on. Because there's a big difference. And Meghan McCain can blow her mouth off all she wants with it. She's not a real conservative. She's a neoconservative. She doesn't believe in any of the things that are actually liberty based. She doesn't believe in liberty. Her dad didn't believe in liberty. That's why her dad would fight with Ron Paul. Her dad would fight with Rand Paul all the time. Uh, her dad would. Her dad called Rand Paul traitor to the country and the and puppet of Putin. And this is what and her dad even blocked the repeal of the ACA, the full repeal of the ACA, and this is what he was doing. So he's not a hero. He's not even conservative. He was a neoconservative, which is essentially which comes based on the idea of Trotsky. Trotsky was a communist. So people should label him as basically a person who actually sympathizes with communism. And that's the only thing you can do. Now, when we look at the our actual second point, which is on George Takei. Now, George Takei is a person who I know he probably means well, but he doesn't even know anything he's talking about when he goes into any type of political or social matters with it. When we go into his actual bio, we understand that as a child, he was actually under the FDR administration. He was taken into their work camps. This was from a this is a progressive that did this. Now, the only people who actually do this are actual Marxists who actually do these things, these acts of racism. Now what does he become later on in life? He becomes a progressive. He becomes one of these guys who believes in progressive and socialism and all this other stuff. Exactly the whole thing that actually put him in a damn work camp to begin with. This is what perplexes me. And then when he goes after people with it, he also jumps in on these political issues before he even understands them. Like, let's say the Jussie Smollett thing. He says, "Oh, this shouldn't happen in this country with it. I cannot believe this is happening in this country. People should be allowed who they love without being harassed." Well, if he would have actually done his research, he would have understood that Chicago is 88% liberal, and we're not going to see conservatives in an 88% liberal city coming out in 2 in the morning to harass someone and saying it's MAGA country. That's not MAGA country in what it call in Chicago, and certainly it's not MAGA country at 2 in the morning. That's usually that's most often when you get those people that are coming out at 2 in the morning they're usually non-political, and they're usually just generic criminals who are out at that time of night. So if Smollett was going to make an accusation, it should have been essentially just generic on criminals. So when he was saying, "Oh, if it would have been a black or if it would have been Muslim or black or Mexican," well, it would seem more realistic, because when you were stating it was a political-based attacks don't happen at 2 in the morning. I'm sorry, dude, but they're not happening at that time of night. It doesn't matter what country you're in. They don't happen in the middle of the night. Unless they're doing property damage, which it doesn't happen. Especially we have not seen in Western countries unless there's some type of religious, unless there's like a Muslim religious zealot that's essentially trying to blow up something. In one of those cases, that's trying to do in the middle of the night, in which we've seen some cases in Europe and in some cases in the Middle East, or in certain areas of Asia, we have not seen that happen in the middle of the night. Most of the things that happen in the middle of the night are actually just purely violent crime. And they're not going to be using such a thing like a ligature to do anything. And if they're going to do a ligature, they're going to make sure they did it right. The only way that's going to happen where it's not going to be done right is if the ligature snaps. So, and then if they say, and then the other thing was bleach. Well, that seemed a little bit fishy to begin with, because there was no change in the hair color, there was no bleach on the actual clothes, and there was no bleach on the ground, which would have actually changed the color of the ground as well. So when we do this, we need to, when people make these statements, that's why us normal people, what we do is we actually look at, does the story make sense before we actually make judgment. We don't say, "Oh, there's a horrible thing to take place in this time, in this century." No, we don't make those statements outright. We say, "Does this make sense?" first, before any of the before we go with emotions at all. We go, "Does the story make sense?" Because anybody out there could be lying, regardless of what political ideology. It doesn't matter, right, left, whatever. Right, left, center, doesn't matter. From libertarian to communist to left wing to right wing, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. It's they could easily be lying. And this is what needs to be understood, is when they start making these accusations of political attacks or attacks on gays, attacks on whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, attacks based on religion, doesn't matter, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Christians, we need to essentially analyze, does this really make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, we need to essentially do our math here. Doesn't make sense, we need to essentially toss it to the side and say, this doesn't make sense, this looks like an actual flat out lie. Well, when people are essentially jumping on this, well, when you keep perpetuating a lie, there's massive complications that can come from this. And that's what he needed to understand is, that's another thing he needed to understand is when people perpetuate lies like this, is it shows how naive he is. And things don't happen like this anymore. People out there just don't care. Oh, I'm gay. Don't care. Oh, I'm lesbian. Don't care. Oh, I'm transgender. Don't care. There's no there's no need for any of these things anymore. People just don't care. There's a very few small unless you're trying to force them to do something or force them to participate. Frankly, people just don't care. And the fact is, until you try to force people to do something, they just don't care. The more you force someone to do something, that's when you're going to get a fight. And that's the only time where you will get a fight. But that's the whole thing with it is it doesn't matter what the issue is. It's like trying to force an atheist to go to church with it. If you say if you say, "Hey, I'm going to go to church," they're going to say, "Don't care." You say, "I'm dragging you." If you say, "I'm dragging you to church," then you're going to get a fight. If you're dragging an atheist to church, you're forcing an atheist to go to church, then you get a fight. It's the same idea, and that's what needs to be understood. If you tell a baker with it, I'm gay, I want to buy a cake. Okay. They don't care. Okay, I'll sell you a cake. If you say, "I want you to make me a wedding cake," well, then you're starting to say you want them to participate in their wedding, and that's where you start. That's where things start to change. And there's a different scenario there, and you want things to be voluntary at every level. And when you start to change these things, that's when things get different. And you might go, "Oh, but how am I gonna? If I'm gay, how am I gonna get a wedding cake?" There's always gonna be a baker that's gonna do this, because the fact is money's always out there, and people are gonna say, "Oh, but there's hatred out there." Well, there's not hatred. People just don't care. That baker's not gonna care. The baker's not gonna go, "Oh my God, I'm gonna go out to that other baker and make sure he doesn't sell you a cake." He doesn't care. He's not going to chase you down. The only time where we've actually seen people chase down for actually allowing for service for business was the last time I've actually seen that on TV was the case of Sarah Huckabee Sanders when she tried to take her family for dinner at a restaurant in D.C. And the actual owner of the restaurant actually, when she tried to bring her family to the restaurant across the street, the owner actually chased her family across the street when they tried to go to another restaurant. And that's the only time where I've seen it, where we've seen left wing people do it, but most other people, right wing, libertarian, well, I wouldn't even say left wing. I'd probably say that's more going on the idea of socialism or communism, and that's what these people support. But as if most of the people in this country really don't care, and that's what people need to get in their heads, and that's what people like Takei need to understand. People just don't care, and once people like that understand with it, and you don't want to vote people who want to you don't want to support people who want to actually use force, because force is exactly what threw George Takei in the actual work camp. That's what people like Hitler are. Hitler was a socialist. Stalin was a communist. Mao was communist, and Bernie's a socialist. So if you want people like that, you get these progressive people, and you got to think progressive was an old, essentially, kind of keyword for following this idea of Marxism without kind of being called out, because it had to be kind of hidden back then, because they knew that a lot of these policies were essentially not unconstitutional, because of the fact they were is to actually implement them, you essentially had to essentially revolt and actually eliminate the Constitution itself, because the ideas of socialism and communism are slavery. That's the whole point, is when you actually do force like that, you have to understand that those are slavery. And that's one point that a lot of people don't understand, is when we get down to that. Now, let's go on to our third topic. Is on the they're talking about the unaired Tucker Carlson interview. A lot of people are kind of trying to say, oh, he's chicken on airing this with it. This is basically this historian. He's a revisionist historian, and Tucker's just frankly not going to give him the light of day. And we've had plenty of revisionist historian out there that try to basically plant a new light on some of these historical figures, and we've seen it for so long. And these are the ones that basically state that what the original New Deal was positive, and from FDR, and trying to plant the idea of nationalized healthcare as being a positive thing. This is what we see from this guy. This guy basically is a run of the norm of what we had for historians during the 20th century, and he's a know-nothing person, and frankly having him on there and showing the interview would be completely pointless, and it's completely unnecessary with it, because most likely the reason why we're talking that it was cut was because it was completely devoid of any content that would be legitimate, and that's the only reason why Tucker would have cut it to begin with. If there's any actual content that is actually legitimate, then Tucker would have kept it in, because as we've seen, Tucker has actually kept on debates that have actually been fiery. But it seems like if the actual thing is going to where there's actually no legitimate content, then we're talking that he's not going to keep it in. And that's understandable, because if this is a person that basically doesn't know, that doesn't actually want to actually study history as is, and doesn't want to report history as is, and use the facts, and wants to essentially revision history to basically make things look better for his worldview, then fine. If you want to do that on your own time with it. But that's not real history. That's garbage. He can actually state that this idea uh, of nationalized healthcare is great and lovely, and this idea of intervention is great and lovely, and this idea of common defense is great and lovely. But the fact is when we start looking at real history, you'll actually see something completely different. I mean, you're talking, he sides with socialists, and which shows that he's basically going to be not only as bad as some of the progressive revisionist historians, he's going to be kind of even a little bit worse, because he's going to be kind of switching into a lot of his Marxist ideas, which is going to basically take a lot of his revisionist ideas and kind of take it up to a new level, and start essentially praising a lot of these boneheaded ideas, and stating that this was the progress of the 20th and 21st centuries. Meanwhile, it's completely illegitimate. When we actually look at history, we need to actually look at it legitimately, and look at facts as is, and look at the actual economic impact as is. If we're going to look at history, we cannot start cherry picking it. We cannot start actually looking at it such a way that we are going to try to enforce our worldview of it. We need to actually look at what actually is the implications of it, and what actually happened because of what these people did. Because when we look at the progressives, we see what they did, and we see the actual future implications of what it is. One of the major things they did was that Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is something they did, and we see that it's caused all of the problems in the Middle East today. It caused the rise of socialism and communism. It caused the rise of Hitler. So when we see all this, I mean, because the Treaty of Versailles, you basically caused well over 100 million people documented, if not 250,000 people documented dead because of it. It could be because we don't even have a lot of documentation. There's a lot of times in these countries you hide a lot of deaths. So we could be talking as high as like 1 billion people dead because of this, due to democide. That's where a country kills its own people through either the acts of starvation or just plain old murder. And when we look at that, and this is what's not going to be provided from these actual historians, because it's not popular. And when they take the idea of nationalized healthcare, well, nationalized healthcare, while it was actually to some degrees adopted early on, these were only actual basic ideas. It didn't actually fully take on until we actually get to one specific man. This guy would have been Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was the actual first one to actually formally announce it as a actual plan for his actual whole country. But because they don't want to actually announce it as a name, they just want to announce it as an actual, he would actually more announce it as a general idea. They'll nitpick around where it actually existed, but they don't want to announce where it actually was fully implemented. They don't want to announce that and announce that, yes, Adolf Hitler was an actual socialist, so it doesn't make their actual ideas look bad. And that's where you get that from. And they don't want to announce that their ideas come with eugenics as well, so that's another point as well. So when we get to these people like that, and the idea that their ideas come with the points of more war, more bloodshed, and that's what the whole point is. And then why we're seeing that Tucker most likely did not air it is because when he's trying to get to some of these points is you're talking most of these people out there will keep ducking around, and he'll keep, and you'll get morons like that that'll keep start making slogans is healthcare for all, and they'll start doing healthcare for all, healthcare is a right, and these other garbage slogans. And when Tucker's just trying to actually get to an actual discussion, Tucker's going to get frustrated and say enough's enough. And that's garbage because he wants an actual discussion and not just spitting out, not just a historian spitting out slogans. And the historian's gonna basically try to use that as an actual jumping point to state that his healthcare is a right. Well, healthcare is not a right; it's a commodity. Based on that point, with you could say slavery is a right, and that's about the same equation with it, because essentially healthcare is based on you actually have equipment and materials and medicine that's actually required for healthcare. You also have workers. Well, those workers can't work for free. The only way you can actually get them to work for free is by compulsion. The act of compelling someone to work without free will is called slavery. It's plain and simple, and that would be the idea. And when we talk about that, that's why we talk as the points of socialism and communism being slavery, and that's what needs to be understood. And most people don't want to actually believe that, want to believe these points, and that's why when we get some of these revisionist historians, they're not actually reporting what's actually true in history, and they don't want to actually report the fact is that these were nothing but rehashed old theories of serfdom. And the newest idea is actually laissez-faire capitalism. It's nothing. It's the newest idea. There has not been anything new since then. People try to claim socialism or communism or any variants thereof from Marxism is a newer idea, but it's not. It's just basically rehashed ideas of serfdom, because that's ultimately what you get to. The only thing you're changing is you're changing a leader who's basically elected from an actual bloodline leader, and that's the only difference. That's what needs to be understood. Now, that's why when we look at this is we need to look at what Tucker's looking for. Tucker's actually looking for guests that are going to offer different points of view, but he also wants context. He wants someone that's actually going to offer something of actual context. He's not going to bring on someone who's going to be spitting out garbage and not going to actually offer some type of back and forth dialogue. If you're going to just start spitting out garbage, then he's not going to allow the interview to air, because that's not the way interviews work. Because if you're just going to keep jumping around questions, that's kind of hogwash. He wants actual questions answered to at least some degree. You can keep making these accusations with it. You can say, "Oh, but I've had dialogue with Noam Chomsky." Well, Noam Chomsky is going to be very, very close to your ideology, and that's going to be basically that's going to be an easy discussion, and that's not hard to have. And Chomsky is going to be he might only have certain disagreements on certain areas with it that makes it a very, very easy discussion to have. And that's pathetic that you make that comparison. I mean, I could basically state the fact that I can have a discussion with with Austin Peterson, but oh, oh, how come Rachel Maddow won't discuss points won't discuss points with me and not completely agree completely agree with my points. Well, the fact is she's coming from the complete opposite spectrum, and that's the reason why, and that's making a completely irrational argument. And anybody can make an irrational argument like that, and it's not very hard. And that would be me making an irrational argument like that, and anybody can come up with any type of rational argument of that sort, and then using that excuse to say, well, they should air it then. Well, if you're going to make an irrational argument, then that's pointless. When two people are coming from opposite points of view, you're claiming yourself as a historian, but you're really a revisionist historian because you're basically putting your political views ahead of actually historical fact, and not actually showing the actual cause and effect of these events. You're more of an actual activist than you are an actual historian. The way I view myself is an actual historian because I'm showing the actual cause and effect of these things. Like, such as I show with the actual points of, such as the Treaty of Versailles. I show the actual cause and effect of the Treaty of Versailles, how it actually impacted what we saw with with World War II, how it actually created the rise of Hitler, how it actually carved up the Middle East, and how it actually created the problems we see in the Middle East. I show that. I do not show the fact of my libertarian conservative points of view going into that. I show purely the fact of what actually went on and why that happened. I show the actual history of World War I previous to that point of why it happened. I do not go with a revisionist view of stating this, of stating the false accusation of the Franz Ferdinand assassination being the cause. I do not go over that because that was completely irrelevant. And every legitimate historian knows that that was an irrelevant point. That's basically saying that the Iraq War was caused because George W. Bush stubbed his toe. That's completely irrelevant. It was because there was a bunch of neocons that wanted to make a bunch of money, and they came up with false intelligence, and basically they wanted to review the area with it. And we were talking that most likely is that we were talking that the region was starting to slip away from dealing with the U.S. dollar from the other areas other than Saudi Arabia and Israel, and this was a major factor. So, and since Iraq was thinking about only accepting the gold as currency, and we had a fiat currency, well, that just couldn't happen. And that was a major factor in what was going on. And that's where we got to a lot of these things. And that's why we need to actually look at some of these reasons of what actually happened. So they created these false things with it, why this happened, which is created the false intelligence, which came about from people like John Bolton, people like Colin Powell, people like Benjamin Netanyahu, people like Elliot Abrams was on there as well. People like George W. Bush peddled this. People like Dick Cheney peddled this. So there were a lot of people peddling these false accusations of what was really going on. And meanwhile, we were actually doing attacks even 30 days before this war in the region, and claiming that the reason we needed to do it was they were shooting back at our planes, which is the most absurd reason to go to war. Hey, they were shooting back at our planes that are bombing them. Well, they're going to, because you're bombing them. And you have no authority to do that, because there's the authority to do any act of wars within Congress. And this is why when we look at some of these things from history, we need to actually judge on fact alone. We can't just basically take some political ideology from some guy and say, well, this is what I believe personally, so this is what I'm basically going to cherry pick in history, and that's the way I'm going to approach my historical view. That's not how things work. I'm sorry, but it's just a fact. And we need to understand that. And you're not going to basically get a valid discussion with Tucker Carlson if you're going to be doing that. And if you're going to basically start launching off with inane type of things and just be out there for an argument. He's not going to have you on there for an argument, and because that doesn't make good TV. Arguments are not good TV. What's good TV is when you start having people that are actually discussing actual points, and things are going to basically maybe get a little bit tense, but you're going to have to be able to deal with it like an adult. And that's what these socialists and communists can't handle. They cannot handle actually acting like actually adults and dealing with these situations. That's why most of these people aren't willing to go on with him and deal with it. And he's not going to air things where someone's acting like a complete and utter child. And you can air the own interview if you want with it, but if you want to show yourself acting like a child and say, I won this with it, well, you can start screaming like a child in a crib with it. It doesn't mean you won anything. And that's the whole point that needs to be discussed. Is he only wants an actual debate. It doesn't matter. There could be tense moments in it, and where he's basically trying to push questions out of you. But if you're not going to answer the questions, and if you're just going to avoid them and start spitting out slogans, universal health care, and all this other garbage, and starts avoiding questions, and not even get back on topic, where he basically has to use like jingle keys on you, and you still don't get back on topic. He's not going to air the debate because it's completely useless. It doesn't even make watchable the segment watchable, and that's the reason why. He'll let you have the actual debate, but or whatever you want to call it, but the fact is it doesn't even make it watchable TV. You can have it, but the fact is to say, see, I was on this show with it, but that's about it. And he's not even going to basically give you the time of day, because he wants an actual segment that's an actual back and forth debate. And if you look at the people who are on the show, it's actually people who are actually discussing back and forth like adults. Even if it's controversial, there's been plenty of controversial people on there, and very few cases, and I've never really heard of any cases out there of people not getting their stuff on TV. And this is probably one of the only situations I've ever heard of, and that needs to be showcased, because it means that you do not fit a basic criteria of actually meeting a standard of a debate. And if you can't meet a standard of a debate, it means that you did something clearly wrong of what would be for proper conduct for any debate for a show. They're looking for basically answering questions. If you're not going to answer questions, and if you're just going to spit out rhetoric, he's not going to air it. If you are not answering clearly, he's probably not going to air it either. And any of these things with it, if you're basically just stating slogans, so basically if he's asking you to validate your answers, and if you're just basically just reiterating the same point you just stated, it's probably not going to air. and this is a fact. You just keep basically repeating what you just said, and you do that, it's not going to air. That's hands down. Now, if you like this little discussion, click like, subscribe, and the little bell. And this is my nightly live stream. Make sure to share it on social media with your friends and everyone else publicly. And I will see you guys tomorrow morning with another live stream. Bye, everyone.